All right, welcome to today's Wednesday webinar. I'm Shannon Dill. I'm with University of Maryland Extension. We're happy to be here for the Women in Ag Wednesday webinars offered the second and fourth Wednesday of each month. And there's a variety of topics we have this year. Really excited about all of them. You can go to our website, www.extension.umd.edu/women-in-ag to see archived webinars or the upcoming webinars. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn today's presentation over to my friend Neith Little. She's an urban agriculture extension agent up in Baltimore City, and she's going to be talking about high tunnel pest management practices. So Neith, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Shannon. It is a pleasure to teach with you as always. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say ahead of time, apologize. My apologies if I start to lag at all. Let me know. It is raining cats and dogs here in Baltimore, and I think there must be a tree leaning on a power line or something because our internet has been flickering. But hopefully, fingers crossed, all will continue well. I see it's raining in upstate New York too. It must be everywhere today. So today we're going to talk about high tunnel pest management practices. But first off, I want to acknowledge that this presentation is part of some work that I'm doing this year, supported by the Maryland USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service to do education about high tunnel pest management practices. The USDA-NRCS funds high tunnel construction as a conservation practice for farms, and I'm working with them to do a little education about once you've got a high tunnel, how do you use it successfully? So we're going to be doing more trainings throughout the year on this topic, and to keep an eye out. If you want more information on this, please sign up to subscribe to the Urban Agriculture e-newsletter, and the link is here, go.umd.edu/subscribe-urban-ag, and that'll also be on the last slide of this presentation. So thank you to the NRCS for the funding for this. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to kind of cover some top pest management practices at a high level. And later this year, we're going to be going into more detail on several of these. So we're going to talk today about what the difference is between a high tunnel and a greenhouse. We're going to talk a lot about temperature management. We're going to talk a little bit about pest management. We're going to talk a little more about soil and growing media, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some safety considerations that are specific to high tunnels. So first off, I just want to bring us all on the same page to understand the difference between a high tunnel and a greenhouse. This is an important difference in terms of funding, if you're trying to get NRCS funding to build a high tunnel, and in terms of zoning, because your local zoning department will probably have a different idea of what permits you need depending on whether you're building a high tunnel or a greenhouse. There is some gray area in between the two, but there are some important differences for funding and zoning. So generally, a high tunnel is considered a temporary structure. So you don't, in some locations, you don't need to get a permanent building permit to build one. This is not the case everywhere. We've run into some issues in suburban Baltimore County. They're still trying to figure this out, but in Baltimore City, it's considered a temporary structure, and in some other jurisdictions, a high tunnel is considered a temporary structure. A greenhouse, however, is considered a permanent structure. So you will need a building permit to build a greenhouse usually. And high tunnels are considered temporary because they're built of kind of flexible temporary materials, flexible plastic, these metal rods. They can last for a long time, but they will need regular maintenance, and it's relatively easy to take them down and do something else with that space if you need to, compared to a greenhouse. High tunnels are made of flexible plastic over metal hoops, and usually there's only a single layer of plastic in the most traditional definition of a high tunnel. We'll talk about heat management a little bit later. It is relatively common to use a double layer of plastic and pump air in between to increase that thermal barrier. And that starts to get into a gray area between a high tunnel and a greenhouse. I have seen structures that I would consider a high tunnel that still had that double layer, but it does start to blur the lines a little bit. Greenhouses, it's definitely a greenhouse if it has rigid plastic or glass walls, like in the bottom right picture. High tunnels, again, are generally passively heated or cooled using airflow and using air barriers, and they usually are not connected to the electric utilities. Sometimes they'll be hooked up to water, though, for drip irrigation, which is very common. Greenhouses are definitely actively heated and cooled using electric fans, using propane and electric heaters, and they often need to be connected to utilities. So this again ties into the building permits you need to build a greenhouse. And in general, in a high tunnel, you grow in the ground or on the ground, at least, as in the top picture. And in a greenhouse, often you grow on tables. And this is usually the kind of setup you would use when you are starting transplants, excuse me, or when you're doing hydroponic production. And again, people have used, a flexible plastic structure to put tables in and start their transplants and cure sweet potatoes on tables. And in that case, it's kind of academic whether it's a high tunnel or a greenhouse. But it traditionally the most precise definition is in ground for a high tunnel, on a table for a greenhouse. And this also affects your nutrient management planning, because if you are growing in the ground in a high tunnel, you can make that high tunnel part of your farm nutrient management plan that the Maryland Extension nutrient management planners can write, that you as a farmer can write. If you're growing on a table for more than just a few transplants, you're probably going to need a controlled environment nutrient management plan, which is a different training. So onwards from the difference between a high tunnel and a greenhouse, I've got one more thing about before you build a high tunnel, just to save you all some heartache, and then we'll get into, once you've got a high tunnel, how do you use it most successfully. So here in Maryland, we try to recommend the Gothic design. That's, let me pull up the laser pointer so I can show you what I'm talking about here. There we go. Can you see? Okay, you can see there's this kind of point at the top. There's this hips on the sides. There's this arch to the roof, and that's what we mean by a Gothic design. Whereas kind of a Quonset hut style tunnel has a more smooth arch all the way across the top. And these Quonset hut style tunnels are very common just further south of us. These Gothic designs are very common just further north of us. Here in Maryland, we're in a situation where it doesn't snow often, but when it does snow, we tend to get like a foot of snow, 3 feet of snow all at once. And what happens when you get that much snow all at once, when it's wet snow, is this. It crushes your high tunnel if you're not careful, if you're not out there pushing the snow off of the plastic, if you don't shed the snow well with that Gothic arch. And even Gothic tunnels can get crushed, but they do tend to be more resistant to this kind of crushing with snow. Wind damage is also very common with high tunnels that haven't been constructed as well as possible. So take some time to make sure you've got the right design for your climate. Penn State Extension has some really great information about high tunnel design. And that's all I'm going to talk about designing high tunnels today. I just wanted to make sure we at least got that PSA out there. The rest of the time we're going to spend today is on best management practices once you've got your high tunnel built. And that said, there are a lot of Quonset hut style high tunnels here in Baltimore. People use them, they work out. It's just a slightly higher risk of damage in extreme snow and wind events. So again, today we're going to talk about temperature management for a while. Your goal when you're managing the temperature in your high tunnel is to prevent an extreme of either cold or heat. Many people start building high tunnels and growing in them to extend the growing season into the cooler shoulders of the year, into the spring and the fall, maybe even into the winter. So usually you think a lot about how to keep your plants warm, but preventing extremes of heat is also really important because in the summer it can get really hot in there. One important thing you can do to prevent these extremes is to monitor the temperature. You can do it in a low-tech way with a thermometer and a clipboard that you check regularly. You can do it in a high-tech way with a temperature probe that's connected by Bluetooth to your phone. But whichever way you end up doing it, it is really helpful to monitor what the temperature is so you can make an informed decision based on what you're seeing in terms of the temperature and what's going to be healthy for your plants. I've actually found this very helpful for myself in my own work as an extension agent. I've got a few Bluetooth temperature loggers that cost about $125 each. And I used one in the extension office when I was doing a germination study with lettuce, and all my lettuce died. It didn't germinate at all. And I went back and looked at the temperature data, and I found out that in the kitchen of the extension office in January, it gets up to 84 degrees because our HVAC system, as we talked about at the beginning, was having some problems. So if you have that logged data, that slightly higher tech investment, it can be helpful to go back and troubleshoot problems that you have to see, was that a pest problem or was it just a temperature problem? So warming, keeping your plants warm. Let's start by talking about how to keep your plants warm. There are several passive warming methods that you can use. Most of those focus on kind of slowing the movement of air and using the sunlight to heat the air and then keep the warm air in place near your plants. Floating row cover is in the top picture. These are some photos from Johnny's seeds. And again, you'll notice that Gothic architecture. But the floating row cover, that's the row cover. Row cover is this kind of thin white cloth you can see lying over the plants, and you'll notice they have little tiny hoops to prop the row cover up so it doesn't touch the plant's leaves too much. And it's relatively easy. It is a little bit of work, but it's relatively easy to every morning you go in and you pull the row cover off so you can get sunlight in and not let it get too hot. And then in the evening, as it starts to cool off, you stretch the row cover in, you kind of tuck the plants into bed for the night to keep them a little bit warmer. You can also lay out strands of wire kind of at knee height, just tripping height across your high tunnel and pull the row cover across. Or these little low tunnels are another option. You could make individual low tunnels in your high tunnel or outdoors even to control the temperature and keep your plants a little bit warmer. And this is a good side note, if you don't have the budget right now or the space to build a high tunnel, these little low tunnels can be a good way to manage the climate for your plants and also to exclude pests. A double wall, at the beginning we talked about the differences between a high tunnel and a greenhouse. And often, especially in cooler climates, people will put 2 layers of flexible plastic on their high tunnel and then insert a little fan that pumps air in between the layers of plastic, so it creates a space for insulation. It creates an insulation space and helps reduce the changes in temperature. Again, this is one of those things that starts to blur the lines between a high tunnel and a greenhouse, but I've never, it's not the sort of thing that you're probably going to get in too much trouble for in zoning wise. You do want to be very careful though with active heating. This is a picture of an electric heater in a high tunnel that was used for transplant production. And the transplants, because they're on tabletops, they're up elevated away from the soil. They don't have the thermal buffering of being in the ground, so they tend to be more sensitive to frost than growing in the ground, which is another reason why greenhouses often need to be more heated actively than high tunnels. But I have known farmers who have had their active heater in their transplant greenhouse too close to, say, a cardboard box or a bag of something, and then it caught on fire and burned part of their transplant greenhouse. So you have to be very careful of fire hazards anytime you're doing active heating on the farm. PSA, this is also important if you're heating up chicks and baby lambs. I have known farmers who have lost barns from trying to keep their chicks warm. You also need to ensure proper ventilation if you're using active heating, especially if you're using a propane heater. You need to vent that propane exhaust out of your high tunnel so you don't asphyxiate yourself and your plants. On to cooling. If you think about it, a high tunnel in the summer, it can get really hot in there. It's definitely going to be hotter than the outdoors, especially if there's no ventilation. This can be a risk to you, as we'll be talking about later in safety risks. It also can cook your crops. Even plants that like heat, like tomatoes, once it gets up to 120 degrees, as it can easily in an unventilated high tunnel in the summer, it will definitely decrease your tomatoes vigor and yield, and can cause some serious damage to your plants if you're not careful. So, and even in the winter, if you're growing cool season crops like little baby lettuces, on a nice sunny day like we've had the past month, when it gets up to 60 degrees and it's sunny, if your sides are down on your high tunnel, it can get pretty warm in there, maybe warmer even than lettuce would prefer. So again, that's another reason why it's important to monitor the temperature in your high tunnel and keep an eye on how things are going and adjust as needed. There are several passive methods for cooling. Shade cloth is what is pictured here. It's kind of a mesh cloth in a dark color that you then roll over the plastic over the top of your high tunnel. Some people, if you just have the hoops and you don't have the plastic, you can lay the shade cloth over and have lots of ventilation, and it's essentially a shade house instead of a high tunnel. But taking the plastic on and off tends to cause a lot of damage, so I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you're done with that plastic. Vents are also important for passive ventilation. Most common is to have the sides of the high tunnel be able to roll up, as you can see in this picture. Roof vents are also used sometimes. Sometimes those roof vents will run the long distance along the high tunnel. Those roof vents, though, I've found tend to be prone to leaks, which can cause problems. And so the roll-up sides tend to be a little bit more popular. If you are using the roll-up sides, you want to think about how you situate your high tunnel on your landscape and where the wind is going to be going, because you want the wind to be able to pass through the sides. So if you think about where the prevailing winds are, that can be important when you're siting your high tunnel. You also need to think about, slope and drainage when you're siting your high tunnel. So this isn't the only consideration, but it is important. And then the end walls of the high tunnel, those short ends, often people add vents to. Whitewash is another cooling method. It can be a little less expensive than the shade cloth. It's a little hard to see here, but in this high tunnel, the walls have been painted with whitewash and sprayed to kind of reduce the amount of light coming through in the summer, so you can grow these lettuces in the summer, even though it's hot. And it's been amazing to me since I started working with urban farmers in Baltimore. It is possible to grow lettuces in high tunnels in the summer. There's been some new varieties developed of particularly heat and bolt resistant lettuces. And they do tend to overhead irrigate the lettuces to keep them cool so that they continue growing lettuces through the summer. But that's kind of an advanced management practice. Because as we talk about pest management, controlling the moisture in your high tunnel is an important way to control disease. Actually, before we get on to that, this picture has a nice example of a high tunnel where they don't have any plastic on, they've just got the shade cloth. So this is more of a shade tunnel than anything, which is another tool available to you. But you can see at the top of this high tunnel, there's the irrigation spigots hanging from the ceiling. And with plant diseases, a lot of plant diseases tend to be spread by water if the leaves of the plants are moist. Fungal diseases and bacteria can spread from the soil through the film of water across the surface of the leaves until they find a pore or an injury and then enter the plant. So when the leaves are dry, there tends to be less disease pressure. So that's one of the potential benefits of having a high tunnel, is you control that you control how much water gets on your plant's leaves instead of having it rain like today. Whenever the weather decides it's going to rain, you can irrigate in a more controlled way, and that can help reduce disease pressure for your plants. Some growers have been growing a lot of their tomatoes in high tunnels for this reason, because tomatoes tend to be particularly prone to waterborne diseases. However, if you overhead irrigate, if you spray your water over the tops of the plant, you kind of reduce the benefit of having that control of water, right? Because you are adding water to the leaves. So drip irrigation, where you lie a flexible tube along the row, and it has little holes in it, and as the water flows through the tube, the water drips out directly to your plants, is considered a best management practice as much as possible. It is a little bit more work to roll out the drip irrigation and roll it back up every year as compared to the overhead irrigation, which is more permanent. But you can also try both. You can have the drip irrigation for most of the time, and then you have the overhead for when you need it, because in terms of insect pests, once you are controlling that irrigation, you tend to start seeing insect pests that like dry conditions, like thrips and mites. And one of the kind of lower risk interventions to reduce those is spraying the thrips and the mites off of the plants with water. So sometimes having overhead irrigation is a useful tool, but I do tend to recommend drip irrigation for your primary irrigation method. For keeping pests out of your high tunnel, you can screen those vents that we talked about, right? You need the vents to allow airflow and circulation and manage the temperature, but having big open windows is a good way to get insects from outside of your high tunnel into your high tunnel. So another best management practice is to put insect screening along your vents, along the sidewalls, if you've got the roll-up sides, along the end vents. And that can help exclude some insect pests. Small ones like thrips and mites will probably still get in, but larger ones like cabbage moths and caterpillars might be excluded that way. And there's a professor in Georgia who's found that some brands of shade cloth actually can be a pretty cost-effective insect screen if you're using a kind that has relatively small mesh. If you're adding beneficial insects, then this also has the added benefit of containing them inside the high tunnel, because it's kind of a challenge to add enough beneficial insects to a field, because they might just fly away to somewhere else, and it's a big uncontained environment. But if you have some ladybugs, some other predatory insects in a small environment like a high tunnel, with the mesh sides kind of containing them in there, you can have a larger effect with the beneficial insects. Another important factor to consider in your high tunnel is what you're growing in. And again, if you're growing in pots on top of tables using hydroponic methods, that's usually more of a greenhouse setup. So I'm going to talk more about growing on the ground or in the ground. And this, again, kind of like the distinction between a high tunnel and a greenhouse, it's important to distinguish between soil and a growing medium. So soil is what we tend to consider the naturally occurring mineral dirt or soil that you find naturally. You might bring fill soil in from somewhere else, but it's kind of naturally occurring from rock that degrades over millennia into sand, silt, and clay with some organic matter. And a growing medium is a man-made mix of materials, usually that doesn't include natural soil very much, maybe only at a small amount or with a little bit of sand. A growing medium is what you might think of as potting mix. It usually is made up of things like perlite, sphagnum moss, coconut coir, maybe some sand, maybe some wood chips, maybe some compost, things like that that are mixed together to create a potting mix, depending on what your growing conditions are and what works for you. And whether you're growing in the ground in the native soil or whether you're growing, say, on top of the ground in an imported growing medium, is going to have a big effect on how you manage that growing medium and on your nutrient management and your water management. Some farmers in Baltimore who I work with do, because of contamination concerns, they do lay down landscape fabric and then bring in either soil or growing medium. Where does the salinity come from in growing media? Yes, let's talk about salinity. So it is, regardless of whether you're growing in soil or in growing media, it's important to monitor the salinity and the pH in your high tunnel. So salinity is salt, but it's not like table salt necessarily. There are several different sources of salt. There can be nitrogen-based salts that come from fertilizers and composts. There can be salt that naturally occurs in the soil and then builds up. And it builds up because in the field outdoors, the rain like we have today will gradually leach water-soluble salts deeper in the soil profile. But in a high tunnel, like we talked about, you don't have those deep soaking rains, which is beneficial for pest management, but means that what happens is usually when you irrigate, the soil gets wet down to maybe 6-8 inches, and then it gets hot and dry, and the water rises back up through the roots of the plants, and the soil dries back up to the surface. And as that action happens where it gets wet just shallowly and dries back up to the surface, it draws salts from that surface layer up to form a crust on the surface of the soil, which is this white crust you can see in this photo in a band along the rows of carrots. And this comes from like naturally occurring salts in the soil. It can also come from imported materials like fertilizers and composts. So you do want to be very careful when you're buying something to grow in, whether that's soil or a growing medium or a compost. Often composts are designed to be added in small amounts to an outdoor area like a raised bed or a field, and they can be kind of naturally high in salts from all of the nitrogen in them. If from mushroom compost and food waste compost tend to be relatively high and concentrated nitrogens and salts, which is not a bad thing if you're putting them in the soil outdoors, and not necessarily a bad thing indoors either. You just need to make sure that they're not too high of a concentration because you don't have that leaching happening in a high tunnel that you would outdoors. So it's a good idea if you're buying compost to add to your high tunnel to get an analysis test from a lab to measure that salt content so you can decide how to mix it in what proportion with other material in your high tunnel so you don't overload it with salt. What is the problem with the salinity being too high? Well, if it's too high, it can reduce the water availability. Salt, salt and water bind together. So that means that even sometimes if your soil is very salty, even if there's water in the soil, the water will bind to the salt and it'll be harder for your plant roots to get that water. It can also reduce nutrient availability and stunt root growth. This eggplant in the photo has purple upper leaves. That's a common characteristic of phosphorus deficiency, where phosphorus is not mobile in the plant. So when the plant is deficient in phosphorus, the new leaves start to turn purple because it just can't put out enough phosphorus to grow those new leaves. How do we reduce salinity? Yes, good question. I will get to that in just a moment. So you might also see dying on the edges of the leaves if your plants are salt stressed. pH is also important. I'm going to keep going and we'll get to the how to reduce salinity in a moment. I'm just remembering which slides we have coming up next. So pH is also an important characteristic of your high tunnel soil or growing medium. Just like in your outdoor garden or farm, pH changes over time. In the outdoors, often pH decreases over time, but in a high tunnel, I've seen commonly pH increases. So you end up with pHs of 7 or 8 even. And at those extremely high pHs, you can have nutrient deficiencies, just like you would at a lower pH. And it also increases the availability of detrimental elements. Usually, if the pH increases or over time, that's due to your irrigation water pH not being optimum. So there are some things you can do to change your irrigation water pH, or you can add sulfur to lower it down. If you've got pH that's too low, you can add lime to raise it up like you would outdoors. We recommend monitoring changes in salinity, monitoring salinity and pH in your high tunnel. Ideally, you would measure twice a year so that you can watch for increasing trends over time. We have a new publication with a nice table in it for interpreting electrical conductivity salinity measurements and making decisions based on that. And if you're interested in learning more about salinity and pH in high tunnels, here are a couple of publications to help you learn more. We taught about this at the winter farmer meetings as well. So I'll mention if you do have high salinity in your high tunnel, if your salt is too high, kind of the best thing to do is to leach the salt out. Well, first you want to figure out where the salt is coming from, right? You want to see what inputs have you added? Have you added fertilizers? Have you added compost? Where could the salt be coming from? You want to test your irrigation water to make sure there's not too much salt in that. And so you want to reduce inputs of salt going forward. But then you also usually the best thing to do next is to try to leach the salts out. And you can do that by either irrigating a lot to try and leach the salts deeper in the soil. You can also leave the plastic off for a season so that these nice soaking rains like we're having right now kind of naturally leach the salts out for you. This can be a high cost to you though, because you're counting on that high tunnel space to be able to produce crops out of season. So I tend to recommend the plastic on a high tunnel. It only has a natural life of about 5 years. Eventually it'll start to wear out. So you're going to have to replace it eventually. So when you do find that you need to replace your high tunnel plastic, it might be worth thinking about taking the plastic off at some point in the year and leaving it off for several months before you replace it with new plastic. So you get some rain in there every time you replace the plastic. But for more information on salinity in high tunnels and that table of interpreting salinity results and information on how to monitor your salinity and your pH, either yourself or with a lab, we've got this fact sheet with a lot more information written down for you. I also want to talk about safety considerations. There are some safety considerations that you need to be careful about in a high tunnel that you might not necessarily worry about quite as much outdoors on a farm. Heat illness is particularly important. Heat stroke is a risk for anyone working outdoors in the heat. It's exacerbated, though, by high humidity and lack of airflow, which is exactly the conditions you have in a high tunnel. Elders, infants, and people with circulatory or heart conditions are at increased risk of heat illness or heat stroke. And you also have to be extra careful when you're wearing personal protective equipment. I know this myself from when I got to work on a farm for a couple of years. I did a lot of the spraying organic fungicides, copper on tomatoes, and eventually we ran out of those bunny suits, those temporary bunny suits that you use for personal protective equipment. And I wore a rain poncho. I wore actually a pretty heavy duty raincoat for my protective equipment one day. And it got really hot in there. So you need to make sure that you're wearing the proper protective equipment. And if you're wearing something like, a bunny suit or a respirator, especially, a respirator will increase your heat. If you're wearing one of those in a high tunnel, you need to limit the amount of time you're in there when it's hot. And then also you should keep an eye on the heat index. OSHA has a nice management table for heat index to watch out. And if you have anyone who is working for you on the farm, you especially need to be careful to follow OSHA guidance and take safety precautions, particularly if they're working in a high tunnel when it starts to get hot. Air quality is also something you want to keep an eye on in a high tunnel, because you have that reduced airflow. It can kind of create these pools of pollutants from the outdoor air. Ozone can kind of pool in stagnant areas, and that can hurt your plants as well as you. This is a picture of ozone damage on a leaf. So there was once a high tunnel that had some kind of inexplicable leaf damage um, to snap beans, and the best we could figure out was that it might have been ozone damage. Um, it's a good idea to keep an eye out for code orange air alerts. When you see the Weather Service put out a code orange alert, especially here in Baltimore, where we have a lot of sources of air pollution, that's when you might want to be particularly careful to not spend too much time in your high tunnel, to make sure you're ventilating it as much as you can to protect your plants. And again, with a code orange alert, you'd want to be reducing your time outside anyway, but especially in a high tunnel where there might be air that's kind of stuck. If you are using pesticides, even organic pesticides, remember you always need to read the label. And the thing with the high tunnel is that they are a semi-enclosed environment. It's kind of this weird gray area between the outdoors, which are as ventilated as possible, and a controlled environment like a greenhouse or a building, which is, something we think about a lot today in the current pandemic situation. We think a lot about air circulation. So we kind of have a same consideration with high tunnels because they're less enclosed than the indoors, but more enclosed than the outdoors. And pesticides have safety precautions depending on how much air circulation there is. Most pesticides that we use, whether they're conventional pesticides or organic pesticides, are labeled for use outdoors. There are specific labels specific recommendations on labels for how to use them and additional safety practices to use when you're using them in a controlled environment like a greenhouse. So if you're using them in a high tunnel, you want to be careful to read the label and see what precautions are listed, and ideally ventilate it as much as possible. Raise the sides, open the end walls, do as much as possible to ventilate the high tunnel and reduce risks to the person doing the application. For more information on urban agriculture, this is the University of Maryland Extension Urban Agriculture website. You can get to that at go.umd.edu/urbanag. And I've got some additional resources linked here. This is a long link, but if you Google Maryland NRCS, you'll get to their website a lot faster than this link. And they have a lot of, helpful information about their high tunnel program. There's the link to the Urban Ag website again. And if you're interested in more information about how to manage high tunnels successfully, we're going to be doing hopefully some workshops if I can figure out how to do in-person stuff in a safe way this late spring and summer. We're definitely going to be putting out some more webinars and videos. And Penn State has a great high tunnel manual with best practices, and University of Delaware has actually done some cool research on what time of year to plant crops in your high tunnel, which is Delaware is about as close to Maryland's climate as you can get without being in Maryland. So I do recommend their high tunnel planting schedule as a good way to get started in figuring out your planting schedule in your high tunnel. Again, my name is Nia Little. I work for University of Maryland Extension as an urban agriculture extension educator, primarily in Baltimore City. I am a public servant. You are the public. So I'm going to put in the chat. Here we go. I'm going to put in the chat go.umd.edu/agteach. And if you wouldn't mind going to that link and honestly filling out the survey there, I am a public servant, you are the public, you get to tell me how I'm doing. So that would be very helpful. And Shannon says that you're going to be getting a copy of the recording and the slides as well, so you'll get these links in the slides. I think now we have a little bit of time for questions and discussion.
Yes, we have some questions, Neith, and I'm not sure. It came through to host, so I think it may have just come to me. So some very good questions. The first is, should the area be spaced out? So this was at the beginning. It was about 13 minutes into your presentation. Looking at, should the area be spaced out to determine where the sun is the brightest throughout the seasons before installing the greenhouse? So I guess
Mm,
like orientation on your property.
yeah, there's a lot that goes into deciding where to locate a high tunnel on your property. You do want it to get a good amount of sun. You wouldn't want to put a high tunnel where it's going to be shaded in the afternoon from a building or a tree. Um, so the things that you want to focus on are airflow, water, and sunlight. And you kind of need to try and optimize all three. And slope. Building a high tunnel on a slope generally doesn't work very well. You want to put it in a flat place. Um, you want to try to avoid putting it in a place where seasonal runoff will run through the high tunnel and erode it. And you also want to avoid a place. One of the farmers I work with was trying to find a site for her high tunnel, and she found that there was a spring bubbling up from the soil underneath where she wanted to put it. So that would not have been a good place to put a high tunnel. So you want it to be in a place with not too much, that's well drained, that doesn't have overland erosion, that's at a relatively flat slope, that gets pretty good sunlight. It doesn't have to get, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not like a solar panel that you put on your house, but you don't want it to be shaded in the afternoons. And that gets some good airflow.
Great. The next one is more on ventilation, and you talked some about that. But this was asking about like fans to be used or opening the
Mm,
sides up for ventilation purposes.
yeah, so opening the sides up for ventilation, that's the passive ventilation. Um, Fans are used sometimes. You would need an electric hookup usually to use fans. Some people do get a solar panel, a little solar panel on your high tunnel, and that might be enough to power one of those little fans that you use to kind of inflate the air between two layers of plastic. But a little solar panel on a high tunnel, probably you'd run out of wattage pretty quickly, so you might not be able to power too many fans. If you're using active ventilation like a fan to move air around in the high tunnel, that's um, where you place the fan takes a lot of thought and care, because it's easy to have a fan that just blows and doesn't do anything and doesn't successfully move the air around. So I off the top of my head, I don't have the best recommendations for you for that, but I know that there's some information out there on where to place fans in and that would be more of a greenhouse thing than a high tunnel thing.
Mhm. All right. The next is about lighting. So we talked about fans. The other
Hmm.
is more about lighting to be installed if some plants require more direct sunlight.
Hmm. Yeah, so again, we're starting to get in that gray area between a high tunnel and a greenhouse. If you're starting your transplants in a high tunnel, you might need some extra light, especially in the very early part of the year. Um, if you are just growing a small number of transplants, there are some kind of small scale lights that are available for, a little long strip of LEDs on a pipe frame, for maybe $100, $200. Larger lights that are installed permanently in the roof of the high tunnel starts to be more of a greenhouse practice. Um, and those do tend to be a little bit more expensive. You would look for them more in greenhouse supplies. Um, and again, there's definitely a lot of design considerations there in terms of where the light shines so that it's kind of optimally placed, and different light bulbs and efficiencies and the heat that they put out versus the light that they put out. You start to get into a lot with lights.
Great. The next, let's see, ventilation during the winter months for airflow. Um, what to use during warm months. So I think you talked some about that ventilation question.
Yeah, you can definitely keep growing in a high tunnel through the summer. I've seen people successfully grow a lot of warm season crops like tomatoes. And people have grown relatively tropical crops in a high tunnel in the summer, like ginger or turmeric as well.
All right. Handling pest pressures after an outbreak is similar to crops grown each year. Would the soil need to be changed in case of disease like blight exists? So just talking a little bit more about like pest management and good practices in the high tunnel. So with crop
Yes.
rotation, disease, and pests.
Thank you. That is a very good question. We did not spend much time on pests today. Crop rotation is still a best practice in a high tunnel because you have kind of that limited space. Especially if you only have one high tunnel on your farm, you can have a lot of economic pressure where farmers um, are resistant to rotating their crops in their high tunnels when they've got that, that cash crop that they need to grow in the high tunnel to make it work. Um, but if you grow tomatoes in the same high tunnel every year, eventually you do tend to build up tomato diseases, or lettuces, same thing. So rotating crops in your high tunnel is ideal, especially if you have multiple high tunnels you can rotate crops through. Those rolling high tunnels that you might have seen where they kind of slide to cover one area, and then you can slide it to uncover the first place and cover a new area. That's one way people have developed to make rotating your high tunnel crops a little bit easier, and that also allows for leaching of salts and pH and leaching rains to touch the soil. So that's one method, but it does also it's more expensive to build a rolling high tunnel, and you have to be a little careful about wind damage as well. Sanitation is the cheapest best practice for pest and disease management in a high tunnel. At the end of whatever season you're in, when your crop is starting to die back, it's important to remove any remaining plant material, get it out of the high tunnel, compost it at high temperature, or dispose of it in some other way, because having dead plants in your high tunnel from one crop to another is a major way for pests and diseases to be harbored through different seasons. And I know it can be really tempting to kind of stretch out your harvest and say, oh, I can get one more harvest of these collard greens. There's a few more leaves on it. But that's where you need to start thinking about when you're not getting as much back from keeping that plant a little bit longer. Instead, it might be worth having a little bit of a clean break between crops where you remove the crops that are not yielding as well, and then bring in something new instead of having it growing constantly.
Great. So there's some other about like maybe specs regarding the high tunnel. So one question was about the standard size
Mm-hmm.
for high tunnels most useful in the area. And then the other is, how long it would take to install a high tunnel and how many people.
Yeah. So I will definitely recommend the Penn State, and I'm going to stop. Oh no, actually, I won't stop sharing because it's got the link. The Penn State High Tunnel Manual has a great chapter on high tunnel construction and maintenance. The prices are probably a little out of date because I believe it was published maybe 5 years ago, but it does have some nice specs on size and the kinds of materials you might need. Kits are available. I find in Baltimore where I work, you tend to end up with high tunnels that are maybe 20 feet wide and 50 feet long, somewhere in that range. You can have them larger, you can have them smaller. It really depends on your situation and how much space you have. Uh, but there is kind of a maximum size where eventually it starts to collapse under its own weight. And the Penn State manual has some more details about that. Um, and how long it takes to build a high tunnel. It depends on your experience. You definitely want someone who knows what they're doing, at least one person. I've been on a high tunnel construction day a couple of times, and you tend to need one person who really knows what they're doing and 3 or 4 people who can be hands to hold on to things at least. And the crew doesn't need to know as much if they're willing to follow the instruction of the person who knows what they're doing. And with a good crew, you could get a high tunnel built in a day, maybe 2 days if it's a larger tunnel and people are moving a little more slowly. It's important to dig the footers in well. That's one place where if the poles are not well connected to the soil, Shannon, I think we're getting an echo from you. I'm sorry. If the poles are not well connected to the soil, That has been a place where high tunnels have taken off when it gets windy. So that's important. And then the other piece that I've found requires some skill is connecting the plastic to the high tunnel and getting the plastic stretched really tight. Um, so having someone who has experience doing both of those things is particularly important. You can get a kit that has all the pieces, or you can, if you have more experience, you can kind of comparison shop and get the pieces yourself from different sources. Let's see, I saw there were a couple more questions in the link.
Yes, there's some in the link and then some in the Q&A pod.
Okay.
Installing a high tunnel with roll-up sides, do you recommend closing them at night, even in the summer?
Mm. I think it depends on the temperature. Here in Maryland, sometimes it doesn't cool off at night. So it might be necessary to keep them open at night to let the heat out so it cools off as much as possible for the day. But if it's going to get cold at night, you might want to close them in the summer. I think in Maryland, in July and August, you might just leave those sides up all the time. But then again, um, if you're having issues with people climbing into your high tunnel at night, that might be a different scenario than the temperature management. Yeah, so either way, depending on your situation.
Okay, and there was one more. Is there anything to put in the soil that will bond with salts and precipitate them out?
Mm. Oh gosh, that's a good question. I feel like I read something about that recently, and I don't want to misspeak because I'm not sure if I have a research-based answer on that. I think there might be something out there that's claiming to do that, but I don't know the research on that currently.
Yeah, I feel like we've had some issues with like tidal areas with like high tides during, say, like a
Yeah.
hurricane. Was it gypsum?
Gypsum, yeah, that's what I
Like,
was thinking of. I think there
um,
is something with gypsum.
yeah, and I have no clue what the recommended amount is. But I would
Yeah.
definitely, a soil test would help even figure out what your parts per million are, because you're going to want to know
Hmm.
that very specifically.
Hmm. Yeah, and if you're dealing with a place like that that's had saltwater intrusion, definitely reach out to your local extension agent for a little bit more one-on-one help. I think Utah has some saline soils guidance on gypsum like that I haven't looked into too much because it's a slightly different situation than the kind of salts you would have in your high tunnel. But if you've got the saltwater intrusion like Shannon was talking about, then you definitely need to look into that.
So there was some questions about drip irrigation. Are the crops best managed using like a drip system? You mentioned like your leaves can harbor pests and disease. And then the same individual is having some issues with flea beetle pest
Mm.
damage as a problem in a garden, and curious if there was issues in the high tunnel.
Yeah, so drip irrigation and flea beetles. So drip irrigation, I definitely do recommend for the pest management practices, also because it's more efficient use of your water, and it reduces weed pressure as well, right? If the water is going directly to your crops, then it's a little bit harder for weeds to get at the water, so your crops are better able to compete against weeds. Flea beetles are annoying. They're the worst. They're all I find that starting transplants indoors and then planting them outdoors when they're a little larger can help with reducing flea beetle damage because once crops get a little larger, sometimes they can outgrow flea beetles. But when you put out a teeny tiny little seedling, when a little seedling pops out of the ground, then they get eaten up by flea beetles way too fast. There are also some organic pesticides that people use for flea beetles. I forget if Entrust is I think it might be in trust. I'm forgetting which one exactly, but there are if you use a lot of the people I work with prefer organic methods, so that's why I jumped to that. Um, but if you look for I'll look that up while we're talking about the next one. What was the next question?
Yeah, the other one was more about starting seeds. So if you have a high tunnel for seed starts, in the future, do you have recommendations for heating sources without electricity? And then the other, let's see, just a little bit more about the differences in high tunnel and greenhouses. Can you
Okay.
use your high tunnel as a greenhouse?
Ah, yeah, so entrust was the wrong one. Entrust is for cabbage worms, but there is something available for flea beetle. So the question was about, can, I'm sorry, I shouldn't multitask. So the question was, can you use your high tunnel as a greenhouse? And there was another piece to the question.
Yes, and then recommendations for a heating source without electricity if you're
Mm,
like doing starting seeds
mm-hmm,
in the early spring.
mm. Okay, yes, thank you. So a lot of people do use high tunnels for starting seeds for their transplants, their seedlings. Um, I think if you're using passive methods, like we talked about, without the electricity, you could use a low tunnel, some row cover to try and reduce freezing on your seedlings. Um, you could also, it's a lot more work, but if you have a heated indoor space right next to your high tunnel, you could bring your seedlings indoors to your basement at night and put them in your high tunnel during the day. Um, low energy heating sources. There are a lot of people use heating mats that are kind of like little heating blankets that you lay that are waterproof that you lay underneath your seedlings to kind of heat them from the roots up. But those do still use electricity. They just are a little bit more energy efficient um, and less of a fire risk usually than the heaters that try to heat all of the air in the high tunnel. So I think if you don't have electricity, you would primarily want to try to figure out how to create a little micro environment around your seedlings where it's reducing the air movement around the seedlings and maybe making a little low tunnel over them. Um, yes, that would be my best recommendation.
A nice basement or spare room. All right. I think that's all the questions. You have Nia's contact information if you want to reach out to her separately. You guys had really great questions. So
Hmm.
thank you, Nia, very much for your presentation today. And thank you everyone that took time to join us. I think I added her survey link in here. For some reason, Nia, it was private. So
Oh, thank
is
you.
in the chat here, go.umd.edu/agteach. It has to be all capitals there. She'd love to hear from you. Let's see. And I think that's it.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us today.